Who was Asenath? The foreign woman whose forbidden marriage to Joseph should have destroyed God's covenant forever. Why does the Bible mention her name only 3 times, yet her union became the foundation for 2 of Israel's most powerful tribes? What hidden truth about this Egyptian princess has been buried in plain sight for over 3,000 years? And how did a marriage that violated every law Moses would later give actually become part of God's perfect plan? Hold on to that thought, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see God's sovereignty. Asenath appears only in Genesis 41, 45, 41, 50, and 46, 20. Yet those 3 brief mentions shaped 2 entire tribes of Israel. Here's what's mind-blowing. When Pharaoh gave Joseph this Egyptian wife, it wasn't just a political alliance. It was supposed to be the end of Abraham's bloodline. According to every law that would later define Israel, this marriage should never have happened. The NASB calls her Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, while the ESV identifies her as coming from the very heart of Egyptian paganism. 1 woman, 3 verses, 2 tribes, and a mystery that rabbis have debated for millennia. To understand Asenath, we must step inside ancient Egypt during the reign of the pharaohs, a world of towering pyramids, golden temples, and gods with the heads of animals. This wasn't just any civilization. This was the superpower that controlled the known world around 1700 BC. Archaeological evidence shows us that during Joseph's time, Egypt was at the height of its Middle Kingdom period, with Memphis and Thebes serving as centers of unimaginable wealth and religious power. Picture massive stone temples where hundreds of priests performed daily rituals to Ra, the sun god, and Pater, creator of the universe. The air would have been thick with incense, the walls covered in hieroglyphics, telling stories of divine pharaohs who were considered gods themselves. On, modern-day Heliopolis, was the Vatican of ancient Egypt. This wasn't some backwater town. This was ground zero for Egyptian religion. According to biblical dictionaries, On was the center of solar worship, where the most powerful priests in Egypt served the sun god Ra. The priests here didn't just perform ceremonies, they controlled the spiritual destiny of an empire. And right in the middle of this pagan paradise lived a young woman who was about to become the most unlikely part of God's plan. But here's where it gets crazy. Her father wasn't just any priest. Potiphar wasn't your average religious leader. John MacArthur's commentary explains that as priest of On, Potiphar held one of the most prestigious religious positions in all of Egypt. Think of him as the Egyptian equivalent of a high priest, but with political power that could influence Pharaoh himself. The name Asenath means belonging to the goddess Neith, an Egyptian war goddess. From birth, this woman was literally named after a pagan deity. Biblical scholars note that her very identity was wrapped up in Egyptian polytheism. She would have grown up in luxury, surrounded by Egyptian nobility, trained in the mysteries of their gods, and destined to marry within Egypt's religious elite. This was not an ordinary woman. She was Egyptian royalty, pagan priestess material, and completely off-limits to any Hebrew who wanted to stay faithful to the God of Abraham. So why would God orchestrate this impossible union? Genesis 41:45 records that Pharaoh himself gave Asenath to Joseph as his wife. This wasn't a love story, it was a political power move. Picture this scene. Joseph, the Hebrew slave turned vizier, standing before the most powerful man on earth, receiving not just authority over Egypt's economy, but marriage into Egypt's most sacred family. From a human perspective, this was brilliant politics. Pharaoh was cementing Joseph's loyalty by making him family with Egypt's religious establishment. But from a biblical perspective, this should have been a disaster. According to future Mosaic law, marrying foreign women who worshipped other gods was strictly forbidden. This union violated everything that would later define Hebrew identity. Moses would command the Israelites to completely separate from pagan nations, especially their religious practices. Yet here was Joseph, the same Joseph who refused Potiphar's wife because it would be sin against God, accepting a marriage that connected him directly to Egypt's pagan priesthood. But what if I told you this forbidden marriage was actually part of God's plan all along? The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. On one side, you had Asenath, raised in a world where pharaohs were gods, where the Nile was sacred, where Ra controlled the sun, and where death meant judgment by animal-headed deities in elaborate afterlife rituals. Ancient Egyptian religion was incredibly complex. They worshipped over 2,000 different gods and goddesses. Asenath would have participated in festivals honoring Isis, Osiris, and Horus. She would have believed that her father's prayers could influence the flooding of the Nile, that sacred bulls were divine, and that golden statues had real spiritual power. On the other side was Joseph, a man who had encountered the one true God in dreams and visions, who knew that there was only one Creator, who had seen God's sovereignty over nations and famines, who understood that idols were powerless and that righteousness mattered more than rituals. Imagine the conversations in that household. Picture Asenath watching Joseph pray to an invisible God, seeing him refuse to bow before Egyptian statues, witnessing him interpret dreams through divine revelation rather than magic formulas. MacArthur notes that this marriage represented the collision of two completely incompatible worldviews. It should have destroyed either Joseph's faith or their relationship. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating. While the Bible gives us only 3 brief mentions of Asenath, Jewish tradition and ancient writings tell us so much more. According to rabbinic literature preserved in texts like Joseph and Asenath, an ancient Jewish novel, Asenath underwent a dramatic spiritual transformation. The story describes how she initially rejected Joseph because he was Hebrew, how she destroyed her Egyptian idols in a moment of revelation, and how she experienced a divine visitation that completely changed her heart. Ancient Jewish commentary suggests that Asenath wasn't just some random Egyptian woman. She may have been secretly connected to Jacob's family through a complex genealogy involving Dinah, Jacob's daughter. Some rabbis taught that God had been preparing this union for generations. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt have uncovered marriage contracts and religious documents from this exact period, showing us how political marriages worked and how conversion to foreign religions happened in the ancient world. But here's the most incredible part. Early Christian writers like Jerome and John Chrysostom saw Asenath as a symbol of the Gentile church, foreigners who would be grafted into God's family through faith, not bloodline. You're about to discover that her transformation wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. According to tradition, Asenath's conversion wasn't gradual, it was revolutionary. Picture this young Egyptian princess, surrounded by gold and glory, suddenly realizing that all her gods were powerless lies. The ancient text Joseph and Asenath describes her smashing her idols, throwing away her royal garments, and crying out to the God of Joseph for mercy. MacArthur's commentary emphasizes that this wasn't just about changing religions, this was about Asenath choosing to join a covenant people who had no earthly kingdom, no political power, and no guarantee except God's promises. Imagine her walking away from everything that defined her identity. No more priestess training, no more palace luxuries, no more connections to the most powerful religious system on earth. Instead, she chose to worship an invisible God who demanded moral purity over ritual performance. The transformation went deeper than religion. It changed her entire understanding of purpose. Instead of serving Egyptian gods who demanded endless offerings, she served a God who had already provided everything needed for life and salvation. And here's what will blow your mind. Her choice to abandon Egyptian religion didn't just affect her, it shaped the spiritual DNA of 2 entire tribes of Israel. Genesis 41:50 and 46:20 record that Joseph and Asenath had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. But these weren't just any children, these boys became 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Think about that. Half Egyptian children, born to a former pagan priestess, became fundamental building blocks of God's chosen people. MacArthur points out that when Jacob blessed his grandsons in Genesis 48, he actually gave Ephraim the greater blessing, making this half-Egyptian tribe one of the most prominent in Israel's future. The northern kingdom of Israel was often called Ephraim because of this tribe's significance. But here's the prophetic bombshell. Asenath's story became a preview of the gospel itself. Just like she was a Gentile who joined God's family through faith, millions of non-Jews would later be grafted into spiritual Israel through Christ. Biblical prophecy experts note that her marriage represents God's heart for all nations, not just ethnic Israel. Her transformation from Egyptian priestess to Hebrew matriarch foreshadowed how God would call people from every tribe and tongue into his kingdom. And this brings us to the most powerful truth of all. Asenath's story isn't just ancient history, it's your story. Maybe you come from a background that seems completely incompatible with faith. Maybe your family has a religious tradition that has nothing to do with biblical Christianity. Maybe you feel like your past disqualifies you from God's purposes. Asenath proves that God doesn't just tolerate unlikely people in his plan, he specializes in them. She shows us that your background doesn't determine your destiny, that God can take someone from the heart of paganism and make them a mother in Israel. Her transformation reminds us that faith isn't about where you come from, it's about where you're going. God didn't need her to have Hebrew bloodline or perfect religious training. He just needed her to say yes to his call and no to her past. If God could take an Egyptian priestess and make her essential to his covenant people, imagine what he can do with your life when you surrender it completely to him. There are dozens more forgotten figures hiding in Scripture, each with stories that will challenge everything you thought you knew about God's plan. Don't forget to subscribe, so we can keep uncovering the lives hidden in Scripture, one amazing story at a time. Because when you discover how God uses the most unlikely people, you'll never doubt that he can use you too. Next time we're diving into the story of someone even more controversial than Asenath, and you won't believe how their scandal became part of Jesus' own family tree. I'm about to tell you something that might sting, but you need to hear it. The version of yourself 1 year from now is either going to thank you for subscribing to this channel or regret that you missed out on hundreds of life-changing biblical insights. Every week I pour hours into researching stories like Asenath's, stories that most Christians never discover because they're buried in footnotes and commentaries. But here's the harsh truth. If you don't subscribe right now, YouTube will never show you another one of these videos. The algorithm doesn't care about your spiritual growth. So you have a choice. You can hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with your small group, your family, your friends, who need to know that God can transform anyone. Or you can scroll away and keep settling for surface-level Christianity, while these incredible truths remain hidden. Drop a comment and tell me which biblical character you want me to uncover next. Because the people who engage are the ones who get the exclusive content, the deeper teachings, and the discoveries that change everything. Don't be the person who looks back and wishes they had paid attention when God was trying to show them something profound.